Sienna Blake tilted the champagne flute sideways with two fingers, casual, almost bored, and let the liquid pour directly onto Claire Ashford's shoes. Not an accident, not a stumble. A choice, made slowly, while 200 people watched. The gold liquid darkened the navy satin of Claire's heels, pooled on the marble floor, and Sienna smiled at the small crowd gathering. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, not sorry at all. "I didn't see you standing there. You just blend in so well." Laughter rippled through the lobby. Claire didn't move. She stood very still with her hands at her sides, and she looked at Nathan, who looked away. If you've ever been in a room where everyone laughed at you and the one person who should have defended you turned his face to the wall, then you already know exactly what Claire felt in that moment. Stay with us until the end of this story. Hit like, and drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, slipped inside a manila envelope with the Meridian Foundation letterhead embossed in navy and gold. Claire almost didn't open it. She recognized the gala name. She'd attended 4 of them in the years when she was still Nathan's wife in any real sense, back when she still believed that showing up was the same as mattering. But those years were a long time ago, and Claire had spent the months since their separation learning the difference between the two. She set the envelope on her kitchen counter and went back to her coffee. It sat there for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, she opened it. The card inside was thick stock, the kind that costs more than most people spend on dinner. The 18th Annual Meridian Foundation Gala. An evening in support of architectural education and urban renewal. The Harrington Tower, Manhattan. Claire read it twice, and something moved through her chest. Not excitement, not grief. Something older and harder than either. She knew the Harrington Tower. Her father had built it. She RSVP'd yes. Before she could talk herself out of it. She didn't tell her father she was going. She didn't tell anyone. Claire had lived most of her adult life inside a particular kind of quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The other kind. The kind you develop when you've learned that speaking up costs more than staying silent. When you've spent so many years translating yourself into a version that takes up less space that you've nearly forgotten what the original looked like. She was 34 years old and had been doing this since she was 22, when she met Nathan Cross at an industry mixer during her final year at Columbia's graduate program in urban planning. He was 27, working for a mid-sized firm in Midtown, restless and hungry and good-looking in the way that made people want to give him things. He talked about architecture the way other people talked about religion, with a kind of righteous certainty that whatever he believed was correct and whatever other people believed was smaller than what he believed. Claire had been drawn to that certainty. She'd grown up in a family where power was so large and so present that it became something she wanted to move away from, not toward. Her father, Charles Ashford, had built Ashford Global from a single property in the Bronx into one of the most formidable real estate development companies on the eastern seaboard. He was a name people said carefully. Claire had grown up watching doors open at the sound of it and had decided early that she wanted doors to open for her on her own terms, or not at all. Meeting Nathan felt like that, like a door opening that belonged only to her. She hid what she came from. Not completely. Nathan knew she had money, knew her father was in real estate, but she minimized it, downplayed. Let him believe her family was comfortable rather than foundational. It was easy to do. Nathan wasn't particularly curious about other people's histories when his own was so much more interesting to him. They married when she was 24. It was a small ceremony, Claire's choice, though Nathan had no objections. Her father came, sat in the front row with his wife Margaret, and said nothing unkind about Nathan directly, which was its own form of commentary. "You know what you're doing," Charles had said to her the night before, not quite a question. "I do," Claire said. He'd looked at her for a long moment. "All right, then." For 7 years, Claire had made herself useful in ways that never showed up on any official record. The first time was within 8 months of their wedding. Nathan had been trying to break away from the firm he worked for. He had 2 small commissions, a residential renovation in Park Slope and a coffee shop build-out in the West Village, and he was convinced he could make it on his own if he could just get the startup capital for his own practice. He'd been to 3 banks. All 3 had declined. Claire looked at his financials one evening while he was in the shower and understood immediately why the banks had said no. The numbers were genuinely bad. He had strong design instincts, but no business sense whatsoever. He'd underpriced the Park Slope job by 30% and hadn't accounted for the material cost increase on the West Village project, so he was already operating at a loss before he'd even opened his own doors. She spent 2 weeks quietly restructuring his books. Then she arranged, through a small investment LLC she'd set up years earlier under her mother's maiden name, Harmon Capital, for an anonymous seed investment to appear. She coached Nathan on how to approach a fourth bank with revised projections. The loan came through. Nathan Cross Architecture opened in a sublet office in Tribeca in the spring of their second year of marriage. Nathan came home that night with a bottle of wine he couldn't really afford and told her he'd finally done it, finally made it happen. Claire smiled and said she was proud of him. She was. She was also exhausted in a way she didn't have words for yet. The interventions became regular over the years. She was quiet about all of them. When a contractor on Nathan's first major commercial project threatened to pull out over a payment dispute, it was Harmon Capital that quietly settled the outstanding balance. When a boutique hotel commission in Chelsea, the project that first got Nathan written up in Architectural Digest, was nearly derailed by a zoning issue, Claire spent 3 weeks working a contact in the city planning office, someone she knew through her father's network, to get the variance approved. She never mentioned it to Nathan. She let him believe his project manager had handled it. She didn't lie exactly. She just didn't tell the whole truth. Later, she would spend a lot of time thinking about whether that distinction mattered. By the time Nathan's firm had grown to 12 employees and a waiting list of clients, something else had already started to happen. Something Claire noticed first as a shift in the quality of silence between them, then as a pattern of evenings when he came home late, then as a change in the way he looked at her across restaurant tables when he thought she wasn't watching. He was looking at her like she was furniture. She brought it up once, plainly, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with coffee going cold between them. "I feel like you've stopped seeing me," she said. "Like I'm just here, like part of the background." Nathan looked up from his phone. "Claire, come on. I'm serious. I see you. I'm looking at you right now. That's not what I mean, and you know it." He put his phone down then. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know well, careful, slightly impatient, the expression of a man calculating how much sincerity the moment required. "I'm under a lot of pressure right now," he said. "The Brennan project is 3 weeks behind, and I have a presentation to Hartwell Properties on Friday. I can't—" He stopped, rubbed his eyes. "Can we talk about this later?" "When later?" "Claire." She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Later never came, or it came in a form she hadn't anticipated. A Friday night 6 months after that conversation, when Nathan told her he needed some space, that things had felt off between them for a while, that he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said it in the hallway of their apartment, still in his coat, not quite making eye contact. Claire stood and listened to all of it, and felt something inside her go very, very still. "Is there someone else?" she asked. A pause. "It's complicated." Which meant yes. His name wasn't something she heard right away. She found out about Sienna Blake the way most people find out about these things. By accident, through a mutual acquaintance who assumed Claire already knew, who mentioned it casually over lunch in the way people do when they think they're not telling you anything you don't already know. "Sienna Blake," Claire repeated. "The influencer. Lifestyle brand, big following. They've been... I thought you..." The woman across from her went quiet. "I'm sorry, I assumed." Claire shook her head. "Don't worry about it." She went home, looked Sienna Blake up on her phone, and sat for a long time looking at the photographs. Sienna was 27, beautiful in an effortful way, with a curated online presence built around luxury travel and expensive clothing and what she described in her profile as living intentionally. She had 1.2 million followers. Her most recent post was a photograph of a dinner table at a restaurant Claire recognized, a place Nathan had told her he was going with a client 3 weeks ago. Claire set her phone down on the counter. She sat at her kitchen table until it was dark outside. Then she got up, washed her face, and called her father. Grub. The divorce proceedings were quiet, which was Claire's choice. She didn't want to fight. She wanted out, and she wanted out cleanly, without the kind of public spectacle that would cost both of them something they couldn't get back. Her lawyer, a woman named Patricia Kwan, who had handled 3 Ashford family legal matters over the years and had a manner that suggested she'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it, drafted a settlement that was fair without being generous. Claire didn't take the apartment. She didn't want it. Nathan seemed slightly stunned by how uncomplicated she was being. "You're not going to," he started in one of their last direct conversations before everything went through lawyers. "No," Claire said, "because you could—" "I know what I could do, Nathan." He looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite gratitude. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, and Claire thought that was probably true and also thought that it didn't matter very much either way. "I know," she said. "Take care of yourself." She moved into a furnished apartment in the West 60s for 2 months while she figured out what came next. Her father didn't push her. He called every few days, kept the conversation short, asked how she was sleeping. Margaret sent food, actual food, containers of it, left with the doorman because Claire had told her not to come up. "Your mother is worried," Charles told her on one of those calls. "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. She's still worried." Claire looked out her window at the building across the street. "Dad," she said, "I want to come back." A pause, then, "To the company?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. "You're sure?" "I've been sure for a while. I just—" She stopped, started again. "I got a little lost." "All right," Charles said, and something in his voice shifted. Something that had been held carefully in check for a long time let go, just slightly. "Come in Monday. We'll talk about what makes sense." She went in Monday. They talked. By the end of October, Claire Ashford had an office on the 38th floor of the Ashford Global Headquarters, and a role that her father had kept quietly open for years in the way that parents keep certain things open without saying so. Not a job created for her, but one that had always been waiting. She was good at it, better than good. She spent the next several months relearning how to take up space. The night of the Meridian Foundation Gala, Claire dressed alone in her new apartment, a real one now, not a temporary landing place, but somewhere she'd actually chosen, a pre-war building on the Upper West Side with high ceilings and old floors that creaked in specific spots she'd memorized. She put on the navy dress she'd had for 2 years. She'd almost bought something new, had stood in 2 different boutiques and decided against it each time without fully understanding why. The navy dress was simple and well-made, and it was hers. That felt like enough. She took a cab instead of a car service. She looked out the window at the city going dark and felt something she recognized eventually as anticipation. Not for Nathan, not for any particular confrontation. Something quieter than that. The feeling of a decision already made, already irreversible, just waiting for the moment that would make it visible. The Harrington Tower rose ahead of her. Her father had built it 18 years ago. She knew this building the way she knew her own handwriting. The lobby had been transformed for the evening, long-stemmed arrangements on pedestals, soft lighting that turned the marble floor honey gold, men in dark suits and women in things that cost what Claire's kitchen renovation had cost. She checked her coat and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray and stood for a moment just inside the main entrance, orienting herself. She saw Nathan before he saw her. He was near the bar, standing with a small group of people she half recognized from the architecture world, and he was laughing at something someone had said. He looked good. He'd always looked good in a suit that had never been in question. And beside him, with her hand resting very lightly on his arm and her attention scanning the room in the way of someone who is always looking for the more important thing to look at, was Sienna Blake. In person, Sienna was striking. Taller than she appeared in photographs, in a dress that was clearly expensive, with dark hair that someone had spent real time on. She wore a diamond necklace that caught the light when she moved, and she moved as though she expected to catch light. Claire watched them for a moment. She felt something, not the thing she'd braced herself for, not the twist of pain or the flush of humiliation, something steadier, something closer to clarity. She turned and went to find someone she knew from the foundation board. It was perhaps 20 minutes later when it happened. Claire had been moving toward the hallway that led to the main ballroom. Someone on the board had mentioned there was a private exhibit space set up with architectural renderings she might find interesting. She wasn't in a hurry. She was holding her second glass of champagne, and she was thinking about something her deputy had said that afternoon about the affordable housing proposal they were presenting to the city council next week. She almost didn't hear Sienna's voice at first because she wasn't expecting to be addressed. "Excuse me," Sienna said, not loud, almost pleasant. "Are you... Wait, you're Nathan's ex-wife, aren't you?" Claire turned. Sienna was standing 3 feet away with two women Claire didn't recognize. Followers or friends or both. The diamond necklace caught the light. Up close, Sienna was even more precisely assembled than Claire had initially registered. The makeup was expert, the posture was practiced, and the smile was the specific smile of someone who has decided this interaction is going to be entertaining. "Claire, right?" Sienna said. "Claire Ashford?" "That's right," Claire said. "I thought so. Nathan showed me a photo." Sienna tilted her head slightly. "That dress is..." She made a small sound, something between admiration and its opposite. "It's very simple." "I know. I mean that in a nice way." Sienna's eyes moved down and back up. "It takes a certain confidence to come to something like this in... Well..." One of the women behind Sienna made a small sound. Claire looked at Sienna. She waited. "I don't know what Nathan told you about tonight," Sienna continued, her voice dropping into something that performed intimacy without actually being intimate. "But I'm glad you're here. It must be hard coming to things like this alone. After everything." Her eyes went briefly, pointedly, to Claire's ringless left hand. Claire said nothing. Something shifted in Sienna's expression. The pleasantness thinned. Later, Claire would wonder if it was the not speaking that had done it. The refusal to perform embarrassment, to fill the silence with the apologetic noises Sienna had been expecting. Whatever it was, Sienna's next move wasn't subtle. She raised her champagne glass and let it tip. The pour was slow, unhurried, almost meditative, and it landed across Claire's right shoe, soaking through the satin immediately, spreading cold across her toes. A few drops caught the hem of the navy dress. Several people nearby had stopped talking. "I'm so sorry," Sienna said. No apology in her voice. A smile at the corner of her mouth. "I didn't even see you standing there. You just blend in so well." Someone laughed. Then a few more people. Not everyone, but enough. Enough for the sound to carry, to settle into the marble lobby and sit there. Claire didn't look down at her shoe. She looked at Sienna. Then she looked past Sienna to where Nathan was standing. He'd seen it. She could tell by the set of his jaw and the way he'd gone very still. He met her eyes for less than a second. Then he looked away. That was the moment, not the champagne, not the laughter, not the deliberate cruelty of a woman who had decided Claire was worth nothing. It was the looking away. It was Nathan, who had stood next to her at an altar and meant it, or had thought he meant it, or had meant something at the time, and who in this moment, with 20 people watching, had found the wall more interesting than the woman he used to love. Claire felt the cold champagne soaking through the satin. She turned back to Sienna Blake. She looked at the diamond necklace, really looked at it. Then she looked at Sienna's face, at the smile that had widened slightly in anticipation of whatever Claire was about to do. "No need to apologize," Claire said. Her voice was level. Not cold exactly, but very, very steady. "These things happen." Then she turned and walked toward the hallway, very straight, at a pace that didn't hurry. Behind her, she heard Sienna say something to her friends and heard a small burst of laughter follow it. Claire walked past the exhibit hallway. She walked to a quiet alcove near the elevator bank, where a potted tree blocked the sight line from the lobby. She stood there alone for a moment, feeling the cold wetness of her shoe. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She took out her phone and dialed. "I need you here," she said when her father answered. "The Harrington. Can you come?" A pause. "I'm 20 minutes out." "Okay." "Claire," his voice was careful. "What happened?" "Nothing that can't be addressed," she said. "Just come." She hung up. She stood in the alcove. The party noise carried from the lobby, the music, the voices, the particular sound of a room full of people performing their own importance. 20 minutes. She could wait 20 minutes. She looked down at her ruined shoe and thought about the Harrington Tower. How she'd come here as a child, sat in the unfinished lobby while her father walked the space with his hard hat on. How he'd lifted her onto a concrete ledge so she could see the view while the windows were still open to the wind. She thought about 7 years of quiet work, of Harmon Capital's unacknowledged investments, of rezoning calls and contractor payments, and the long particular exhaustion of being invisible by choice. She thought about Nathan turning his face to the wall. She straightened up. She smoothed the front of her dress. She reached into her small bag and found a compact and checked her reflection, not because she was vain, but because she wanted to see her own face and be certain of what was there. What she found was something she hadn't quite expected. She looked like herself, the real version. Not the one who had moved quietly through 7 years of a marriage built on a foundation she had secretly laid and then allowed someone else to stand on. Not the woman who had answered, "I'm fine," to her father's careful questions when she wasn't fine. Not the woman who had sat in a temporary apartment until she remembered what she was. She looked like Charles Ashford's daughter, and Charles Ashford's daughter had come to the Harrington Tower tonight for a reason. She put the compact away. She walked back toward the lobby, unhurried, and found a seat near the windows where she could watch the room. She would wait for her father, and then, together, they would walk back in. Her father arrived in 17 minutes. She heard him before she saw him, not his voice, but the shift in the room that happened whenever Charles Ashford walked into a space he owned. It was subtle, the way these things always were with him. Not dramatic, not the parting of a crowd, just a small change in the atmosphere, like a pressure adjustment, the kind you feel in your ears before a storm. Claire had grown up noticing it and had spent years trying to pretend it didn't exist, and then more years pretending she didn't come from it. And now she sat near the window of the Harrington lobby and watched her father cross the marble floor in a dark coat and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time all evening. Charles Ashford was 68 years old and moved like a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he belonged somewhere. He was not tall. Claire had inherited his medium height along with his eyes and his stubbornness, but he carried himself with the particular economy of someone who had never needed size to fill a room. He found her immediately, which was also characteristic. He had always been able to find her in a crowd, even when she was small, even when she would have preferred he couldn't. He sat down beside her without preamble. "You've been crying," he said. "I haven't." He looked at her. He had the kind of face that didn't require expression to communicate disapproval. "I haven't cried," Claire said again, quieter. "I wanted to. Earlier, I didn't." "All right." He looked out at the lobby, at the guests, the light, the arrangements on their pedestals, his building, his marble floor. He looked at it all with the mild, proprietary attention of someone reviewing a quarterly report. "Tell me what happened." She told him. Not all of it. Not the 7 years, not Harmon Capital, not the contractor payments or the rezoning calls. That was a conversation for an office, not a lobby. She told him about Sienna Blake and the champagne and the things Sienna had said before she poured it, and about Nathan standing at the edge of the small crowd that had formed, and about the looking away. Charles listened without interrupting. This was something Claire had always respected about her father. He understood that interrupting someone who was telling you a hard thing was a form of selfishness. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at her ruined shoe. "Nathan watched," he said. "Yes." "And did nothing." "No." Another pause. "Do you want to leave?" Claire looked at him. "No," she said. "I want to stay." Something moved across her father's face. Something brief and not quite a smile and more than approval. "Then we'll stay," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out his phone, typed something brief, put it away. "I'll need 20 minutes inside. Some people I should speak to." "Of course." He stood. He looked down at her, and for a moment he looked not like Charles Ashford, the developer, not like the man whose name made doors open, but like her father, just her father. The man who had lifted her onto a concrete ledge in an unfinished building so she could see the view. "You look like your grandmother tonight," he said. "She never let anyone see her rattled either." He walked into the crowd. Claire sat for another minute. Then she got up, went to the restroom, blotted her shoe as well as she could, and went to find someone from the foundation board she'd been meaning to talk to about the urban renewal component of Ashford Global's spring proposal. She did not look for Nathan. She did not avoid him either. She moved through the room the way she'd learned to move through rooms in the months since she'd come back to herself, present, unhurried, engaged with the people she was actually talking to, rather than performing engagement while watching the door. She spoke with 2 board members and a city planning commissioner she knew slightly, and a woman who ran an architecture education nonprofit in the Bronx, who was warm and funny and pessimistic about funding in a way Claire found genuinely refreshing after an evening of people performing optimism at each other. At some point, she became aware that Sienna Blake was watching her from across the room. She didn't react. She kept talking to the nonprofit woman. Her name was Deborah Wills, and she had strong opinions about the way major developers consistently underfunded community design input, which Claire agreed with. And she didn't give Sienna the acknowledgement of a returned look, but she was aware of it, the way you're aware of weather changing. The story of how Claire Ashford had spent 7 years quietly keeping Nathan Cross's career from collapsing was not a story she had ever told out loud to anyone, including her father. It existed in spreadsheets, in LLC filings, in the records of an investment account in her mother's maiden name that she had opened when she was 23 years old with money that was technically hers and had always been hers. A trust her grandmother had left her that Claire had never touched because she'd never needed to, and then had touched for reasons she told herself at the time were love. Maybe they were. She was less certain now. It had started with the seed investment, which she had told herself was just getting him started, just giving him a fair chance. He was talented, genuinely talented. She had believed that then, and believed it now. And it seemed wrong that talent should fail because of bad timing and a small cash flow problem that had nothing to do with the work itself. She had told herself she would do it once and then let him succeed or fail on his own. That was not what happened. The second time was 14 months later. Nathan had taken on a commission for a boutique hotel renovation in the Chelsea neighborhood, a mid-sized project, the biggest he'd attempted, the kind that could either establish a reputation or end one. He'd hired a project manager, a man named Delaney, who came recommended and turned out to be the kind of recommended that means someone wanted to get rid of him without saying so directly. Delaney missed a structural review deadline that triggered a stop work order from the city. The stop work order came at the worst possible moment, 3 weeks before Nathan was scheduled to present the completed renovation to the hotel owner for final sign-off. Nathan didn't know Claire knew. He came home that night looking 10 years older and told her about the stop work order and said he'd been on the phone with the city for 4 hours and couldn't get any traction. He said it with the kind of tightly controlled panic of a man who was not going to show her how frightened he was. "It'll work out," she'd said, and meant it because she had already decided what she was going to do. She called a contact from her father's network the next morning, a woman who worked in the city planning office and had been to their wedding and owed the Ashford family nothing in particular but understood the value of goodwill. Claire didn't ask for anything improper. She asked for the fastest legitimate path to getting the review rescheduled. The woman walked her through it. Claire walked Nathan's project manager through it, anonymously, through a third party, in a way that looked like competence Delaney had developed overnight. The stop work order was lifted in 11 days. Nathan wrote up beautifully in Architectural Digest the following spring. He thanked his team. He thanked the hotel owner. He thanked his own persistence. Claire read the article at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning and felt something she didn't examine too closely at the time. The third and fourth and fifth interventions were smaller. A payment dispute here, a materials delay there, the kind of operational crises that plagued any young firm, and that Nathan consistently underestimated because he was fundamentally a designer, not an operator, and had never developed the instincts for the administrative machinery that kept a business alive. Claire developed them on his behalf, quietly, from the outside, spending hours she didn't account for to anyone on phone calls and financial transfers and problem-solving that never appeared anywhere with her name on it. She had been good at it. That was the part she found hardest to think about later. Not that she'd done it, but that she'd been genuinely good at it. That it had used skills she actually had, skills that were hers, that she had applied entirely in service of an enterprise whose success she never once received credit for. She had told herself she didn't need credit. She had been wrong about that. Not immediately, not dramatically. The wrongness had accumulated over time, the way water accumulates in a basement, not noticed until it's at your ankles. The moment she understood how wrong she'd been came on a Thursday evening in their 6th year of marriage, at a dinner party Nathan had thrown for clients and colleagues at their apartment. Claire had spent 2 days preparing for it. Not just the food, not just the logistics, but the research. The careful seating arrangement that put the two clients who needed to like each other next to each other. The way she'd quietly briefed Nathan on the backstory of the structural engineer they'd invited, because Claire knew the man's history with a competing firm, and Nathan hadn't thought to ask. Dinner went beautifully. Nathan was charming, funny, confident, all the things he was genuinely good at being in the setting where he was most himself. Afterward, when the last guest had left and they were stacking dishes, she heard Nathan on the phone with a colleague who'd called to say the evening had been a success. "Yeah, it all just came together," Nathan said. He was talking easily, leaning against the counter with his tie loosened. "I think it's important to—" He laughed at something the colleague said. "Well, it helps to have good instincts about people, right? You know how to read a room, or you don't." Claire stood at the sink with her hands in soapy water. She waited for him to mention her, to say something, even just Claire put it all together, or my wife did the planning, something. The conversation moved on. Nathan said goodnight to the colleague. He came into the kitchen and picked up a dish towel and said, "Good night, huh?" with the satisfied look of a man who'd just closed a sale. "It was," Claire said. He kissed her on the cheek and went to change out of his suit. She stood at the sink until the water went cold. She didn't raise it with him that night, or the next morning, or the week after. She filed it somewhere in the part of herself where she put things she wasn't ready to look at directly. She'd gotten good at that, too. After the separation, after the apartment and the temporary furnished place, and the calls to her father, Claire had spent a period of time, she would have called it 3 weeks. Margaret would have called it closer to 6, trying to reconstruct a clear understanding of what had actually happened to her marriage. Not the event, not the Sienna Blake fact of it, but the architecture of it. The way one thing had led to another thing had led to this. She came to understand that she had made herself invisible by degrees, and that the degrees had been so gradual she hadn't noticed the accumulation until she was almost entirely gone. She had hidden her identity not because Nathan had asked her to, but because she had wanted something that felt like it was just hers, a life built on her own choices, separate from the weight of her family name. And that impulse had not been wrong exactly. The problem was that in the process of hiding where she came from, she had also started hiding what she was capable of, and then hiding what she was contributing, and then hiding her disappointment when the contribution went unacknowledged, until she was standing at a kitchen sink with cold water and the feeling that the room she was in had somehow been built around her absence. Patricia Kwan, her divorce attorney, had said something during one of their early meetings that Claire kept coming back to. They'd been going through the financial settlement, and Patricia had looked at some of the numbers and looked up at Claire and said, very matter-of-factly, "You know you undersold yourself." "I know," Claire said, significantly. "I know." Patricia had looked at her with the expression of a woman who had sat across from many people in this exact position and had made her peace with the fact that she could not undo the choices they'd already made, only help them stop making those choices going forward. "All right," she said, "let's make sure that doesn't happen here." It hadn't happened there. Claire had walked away from the marriage with what was fair, not generous fair, and she had done it deliberately, not because she was naive about what she was entitled to, but because she didn't want Nathan's money. She had enough of her own. She had always had enough of her own. What she'd lost wasn't money. Wasn't. 3 weeks after she'd moved into the Ashford Global offices, a woman named Lena Park appeared at Claire's door with a project brief and a reputation for being the person in the company who brought difficult proposals to whoever was new and gauged their reaction as a kind of competency test. Claire had been told about Lena informally by her deputy, a methodical man named Owen, who had worked at Ashford Global for 11 years and communicated primarily through understatement. "Lena is very good at what she does," Owen had said, which Claire understood to mean Lena was difficult and effective in equal measure. Lena came in without waiting to be invited, sat down across from Claire, and put a brief on the desk. Affordable housing proposal, South Bronx corridor, she said. We've been sitting on this for 8 months. Previous leadership wasn't interested. Are you? Claire looked at the brief. She looked at Lena. Why weren't they interested? Margin is thin. ROI timeline is long. There's political complexity with the community board. Lena delivered this as if reading a weather report. Also, the previous VP of development had a personal issue with the project lead. What kind of personal issue? The kind that has nothing to do with the project and everything to do with the VP. And the project lead? Still on staff. His name is Marcus Webb. He's been here 6 years and is, in my opinion, the best site development mind we have. Claire picked up the brief and read the first 3 pages while Lena sat in the chair across from her and didn't fidget. Claire appreciated that. She made a note in the margin on page 2. On page 4, she looked up. Get me a meeting with Marcus Webb, she said, and pull whatever environmental impact assessments they did before the project stalled. Lena nodded once and stood. At the door, she paused. The previous VP left 9 months ago, she said. The project has been waiting for someone to pick it up. I know, Claire said. That's why I'm picking it up. Lena left. Owen appeared in the doorway approximately 4 minutes later. Lena says you passed, he said. There was a test. There's always a test. He looked at the brief she was still holding. Marcus Webb is in Chicago until Thursday. Set it for Friday. Done. She went back to the brief. Outside her window, Manhattan arranged itself in the particular way it did in November, all gray light and bone-bare trees in the parks far below. And Claire read about a housing corridor in the South Bronx that had been waiting 8 months for someone to care about it and thought that this right here, was the thing she'd been trying to build toward without knowing it. Not the office, not the title. This, the work that mattered, that had weight, that she would put her name on. Ooh. She was thinking about Marcus Webb's brief when the Meridian Gala invitation arrived 3 weeks later. It was the timing more than anything else that decided her. She had been back at Ashford Global for almost 2 months. She had sat in enough meetings now to feel the company's shape from the inside, to understand what her father had built and what he'd left incomplete, and where she could go with it. She was starting to feel, not confident exactly, not yet, but capable, starting to feel the ground solid under her feet. And then the invitation to the Harrington Tower arrived, and something in her said, go. Go and see what it feels like to stand in that lobby as who you actually are. She had not anticipated Sienna Blake, or she had anticipated something like it, but not the specific shape of it, not the deliberate quality of it, not the champagne poured with that particular unhurried intentionality that was almost worse than rage, because rage at least implied you mattered enough to provoke. She had not anticipated how much Nathan's silence would cost her in the moment, and how quickly she would recover from it. That last part surprised her. Charles Ashford found her near the bar at 10 minutes to 9. He'd done his 20 minutes of circulation and looked, if anything, slightly refreshed by it. He enjoyed people in small doses, had always said so, and an evening like this was precisely the kind of thing he processed well. He appeared at Claire's shoulder with a glass of scotch. He hadn't finished and said quietly, without looking directly at her, Sienna Blake is wearing the Carver diamonds. Claire turned to look at him. The what? The necklace. The diamond piece she's wearing. It's from the Carver collection. A set He paused, corrected course. A set that was purchased 14 months ago through Harmon Capital's discretionary account. Claire went very still. I had Gerald pull the records this afternoon, Charles said, after you called. Gerald was the Ashford Global Chief Financial Officer, a man who had worked for Charles for 22 years and who Claire suspected knew more about the family's finances than any of them. The necklace was purchased as a gift from Nathan Cross to Sienna Blake. The funds for the purchase cleared through an account that received regular transfers from Harmon Capital. Claire looked across the room at Sienna Blake, at the diamonds catching the light, as she tilted her head back to laugh at something Nathan had said. I didn't, Claire started, stopped, thought. I set the Harmon account to make quarterly distributions to Nathan's personal accounts after the separation. For 18 months, it was part of, she stopped again. It was part of how I wound things down. I didn't cancel it immediately. I know, her father said. I worked that out. She's wearing jewelry I paid for. Yes. Claire looked at her father. His expression was very neutral in the way that meant he was being careful. Dad, she said. Yes. I need to tell you something about the last 7 years. He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he'd been careful not to do all evening, the kind of direct attention he only deployed when he'd decided he needed to understand something fully. All right, he said. Not here, she said, but soon, before anything else happens. He studied her face for a moment, then he nodded once. My office, Monday morning. Yes. He looked back out at the room, at Sienna Blake and the necklace, at Nathan standing nearby, refilling his glass, laughing at something, looking comfortable in a way that made Claire's jaw tighten briefly before she let it go. She called you a charity case, Charles said. She did. In the lobby of a building I own. Yes. His jaw moved slightly. He drank the last of his scotch. All right, he said. Let's see the rest of the evening through. They stood together for a moment, father and daughter, in the lobby of the Harrington Tower. Claire's shoe was still faintly damp. The music from the ballroom was something classical and slightly too loud. Across the room, Sienna Blake was tilting her head for a photograph someone was taking, diamonds catching the light with every movement. And Nathan was watching the photograph happen with the expression of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted and was only beginning to wonder what it would cost. Claire watched him for a moment. She felt the cold that had settled in her shoe. She felt the steadiness that had come back to her in the alcove, looking at her own face in the compact mirror, and that had not left her since. She thought about Harmon Capital, about 14 months of quarterly distributions she hadn't canceled quickly enough, about a diamond necklace on a woman who had stood in a crowd and laughed while someone poured champagne on Claire's feet. There was an accounting coming, not the kind that involved raised voices or public scenes. Claire had never been built for that. And anyway, that wasn't the point. The point was something cleaner and more permanent, the kind of accounting that came from documentation, from institutional weight, from the slow machinery of financial and legal reality asserting itself. She had a meeting with Marcus Webb on Friday about a housing corridor in the South Bronx. She had a meeting with her father on Monday morning. She had 7 years of records in an LLC account that told a very complete story about who had actually built Nathan Cross architecture from the ground up. Claire finished her drink. She set the glass down carefully on a passing tray. I need to make one phone call, she said to her father. Take your time, he said. She went back to the quiet alcove near the elevator bank, the one with the potted tree that blocked the sightline from the lobby. She stood in the same spot she'd stood in earlier, when the champagne was still new on her shoe, and she'd called her father and said, come. She dialed Patricia Kwan. Patricia answered on the third ring, which meant she was still in the office, which was something Claire had observed about Patricia. She was still in the office at 9:15 on a Thursday night, which was either dedication or a difficult home life, and Claire had never asked which. I need a meeting, Claire said. Not about the divorce. That's done. New matter. When? Tomorrow, morning if you can. A pause. Not hesitation. Just the sound of a calendar being consulted. 8:30, Patricia said. I'll be there. Should I know what this is about? Claire looked at the potted tree. She could hear the party from here, the particular sound of a room full of people who believed their positions were permanent. Investment records, she said. 7 years of them. I need to know exactly what they establish and exactly what can be done with them. A short silence. Then Patricia said, in the flat professional tone of someone who had just understood something and had chosen not to say so out loud, I'll have coffee waiting. Claire hung up. She stood for another moment in the alcove. Then she walked back out into the lobby, back toward the light and the marble and the music. Back toward her father, who was standing exactly where she'd left him, holding an empty glass, watching the room with the patience of a man who knew that the room, and everything in it, had more to account for than it currently understood. Patricia Kwan's office was on the 31st floor of a building on Park Avenue that had no signage in the lobby beyond a small brass directory, the kind of building that assumed if you needed to know what was inside it, you already knew. Claire arrived at 8:20, 10 minutes early, which was a habit she'd developed in the last few months without noticing, showing up before she was expected, giving herself time to settle into a space before anything was required of her. The receptionist brought coffee without being asked. Claire sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the city in early morning light, the particular cold clarity of a November Friday in Manhattan, buildings sharp against a pale sky, the street below already moving with the specific urgency of a city that did not acknowledge the previous night. Patricia came in at 8:29, coat still on, bag over her shoulder, coffee already in hand. She sat down across from Claire, shrugged off the coat without standing back up, and looked at Claire with the expression she used when she was ready to listen. "Start from the beginning," she said. Claire started from the beginning. It took 45 minutes. She went through all of it: the seed investment, the Architectural Digest hotel project, the contractor payments, the rezoning contact, the quarterly distributions that had run for 14 months past the separation because she'd set them to automatic and been too hollowed out in those first months to attend to the practical details with the thoroughness they deserved. She described Harmon Capital, the LLC, her mother's maiden name, the account structure, the paper trail that existed in full because Claire had always kept records with the same precision she applied to everything else, which was a kind of irony she had not failed to notice. Patricia listened to all of it without interrupting. She took notes on a legal pad in handwriting that was extremely small and completely illegible to anyone but herself. When Claire finished, Patricia looked at her notes for a moment. "How complete are the records?" she said. "Complete," Claire said. "Full transfer histories, dated documentation on all interventions that involved third parties, correspondence where it exists." She paused. "I wasn't hiding what I was doing for myself. I just wasn't telling anyone else." "Are the records organized?" "Not currently. I can have them organized by Monday." Patricia wrote something. "The rezoning contact, is that documented?" "There are emails. The contact is no longer with the city planning office, so the institutional sensitivity is lower than it would have been." "Good." Patricia put down her pen and looked at Claire directly. "What do you want?" Claire had been thinking about this since the alcove the night before. She'd thought about it in the cab home, in the brief hours of sleep she'd managed, in the shower this morning. She had a clear answer and also a complicated one, and she decided to give Patricia the clear one first. "I want the record to be accurate," she said. "Nathan Cross's career was built substantially on support that came from me, through Harmon Capital, without his knowledge. That support had real financial value. I want that established. And beyond establishing it," Claire was quiet for a moment, "my father is going to want to move on Nathan's company." Patricia's expression didn't change. "Ashford Global?" "Yes." "On what basis?" "Nathan's firm has been carrying a debt load it can't service. He took a significant loan 18 months ago to cover a cash flow gap, the same kind of gap I used to cover quietly. He didn't have the same solution available to him this time." Claire looked at her coffee. "The loan was from a private lender. I found this out last night from Gerald, my father's CFO. The lender has been patient. They won't be patient indefinitely." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "And Ashford Global is in a position to acquire that debt. Ashford Global is in a position to acquire the company outright if the opportunity presents itself correctly. That's a business decision, not a legal one. I know. But the legal question, the Harmon Capital records, that changes the landscape of any acquisition. It changes what Nathan's firm is worth, what the foundation of it actually looks like, and what any due diligence process would surface if someone went looking." Patricia picked up her pen again. "You want the records prepared so that they're available if they become relevant?" "Yes." "That's different from deploying them." "I know that too." Patricia looked at her for a long moment. This was something Claire had always found slightly uncomfortable about Patricia. The woman had an absolute willingness to simply look at you and wait, which made Claire feel assessed in ways she wasn't entirely sure she'd consented to. "This isn't about the champagne," Patricia said finally. "No," Claire said. "The champagne just helped me decide when." Patricia nodded once and went back to her legal pad. "I'll need the records by Monday afternoon. Not Monday morning. Give yourself the morning with your father and then get me what you have. I'll have a framework document drafted by Wednesday." "Thank you." Don't thank me yet. This is going to be a complicated few weeks. She made another note. The quarterly distributions that continued post-separation, the ones that funded the necklace. Are those documented the same way? Yes. Good. That particular detail is going to matter. Claire thought about the diamonds catching the lobby light. She thought about the particular quality of Sienna's smile when she'd said, "You just blend in so well." I thought it might, she said. She spent Friday afternoon at the office, working through the Bronx housing proposal with Marcus Webb, who had returned from Chicago a day early and appeared in her doorway at 2 o'clock with a rolled-up site plan under his arm and the air of a man who had been waiting 8 months to have this conversation and was going to have it whether the timing was ideal or not. Marcus Webb was 41, compact, with the kind of face that showed what he was thinking whether he intended it to or not. He'd been with Ashford Global for 6 years and had the slightly embattled quality of someone whose best work had spent most of that time in a filing cabinet waiting for someone with authority to care about it. He spread the site plan across the conference table in Claire's office and started talking. 40 minutes later, Claire looked up from the plan and said, "This is good." Marcus looked at her like he wasn't sure whether to believe her. "I mean it," she said. "The community design process you're proposing, the resident input integration at the schematic phase, that's not something most developers bother with." "Most developers don't," he said, a little flatly. "That's part of why these projects fail." "I know." She looked at the plan again. "I want to move this to the council agenda for December. That gives us 6 weeks to shore up the community board relationship and get the environmental supplements in order. Is that enough time?" Marcus looked at her for a moment. "It's not a lot of time." "No, but December matters. If we wait for the spring cycle, we lose the funding window." She tapped a line on the plan. "What's the status with the Bronx Borough President's office?" "We have a meeting scheduled for the 15th. They're cautiously interested." "Who's going with you?" "I was planning to take Owen." Claire shook her head. "I'll go." Marcus looked at her again, this time with a different expression, less wariness, something more like recalibration. "Okay," he said. "Is that a problem?" No, it's better, actually." He paused. "The previous VP sent an associate to the last meeting. It didn't land well." "I imagine not." She looked at the plan. 6 weeks, Marcus. Let's not waste them." He rolled the site plan back up, tucked it under his arm, and headed for the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why this project? You've been here, 2 months? You could have picked something easier to start with." Claire thought about it. "Because it was waiting," she said, "and because the work matters. Those two things together don't come along as often as they should." Marcus looked at her for a moment, then nodded like he'd made up his mind about something and left. Owen appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, as was his custom. "Marcus Webb looked almost cheerful," he said. "Is that unusual?" "In my experience, yes." "Good," Claire said. "Block the 15th for the borough president meeting, both of us." "Done." He started to leave, then paused. Patricia Kwan's office called. Confirmed Monday afternoon. "Thank you, Owen." He left. Claire looked at the site plan she'd kept a copy of, spread across her conference table in the gray afternoon light. She thought about the gala last night, about the lobby, about Sienna Blake and Nathan, and the particular quality of silence that follows public humiliation when you've decided not to perform being humiliated. She thought about her Monday morning meeting with her father. She thought about what she needed to say to him and how to say it. Not the facts of it. She'd have the facts organized by then. But the part that came before the facts. The part where she told her father that she'd spent 7 years and a significant portion of her inherited trust money quietly sustaining a man's career and had never told anyone, including him. She was not looking forward to that part. She was going to do it anyway. Monday morning came cold and clear. Claire arrived at the Ashford Global offices at 7:45, an hour before the building's general population. She'd been awake since 5, not from anxiety exactly, but from the particular alertness that came before important conversations, the kind of wakefulness that felt like her mind running a systems check. Her father was already in his office. He was standing at the windows when she knocked on the open door, standing the way he sometimes stood when he was thinking about something large, with his hands behind his back and his weight slightly forward, looking out at the city. He turned when she came in. "Coffee's on the table," he said. She poured a cup and sat in one of the chairs across from his desk. He came and sat behind it, which was in itself a signal. He could have sat in the other chair across from her, the informal configuration. But he'd chosen the desk, which meant he was approaching this as Charles Ashford, who ran a company, not only as Claire's father. She understood that. She appreciated it, actually. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She had organized the account records over the weekend into a summary document, 43 pages, clean and annotated, because Claire didn't know how to present financial information sloppily, and she set a copy on the desk in front of him. She walked him through it methodically. The seed investment, the hotel project, every intervention, every transfer, the reasoning she'd used at the time, the structure of Harmon Capital, the quarterly distributions that had continued into the separation period, the necklace. Her father did not interrupt. He read the summary pages as she spoke, following along, and his face was extremely still in the way that meant he was processing something that required the full capacity of his attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You used the Harmon Trust," he said. "Yes." "That money was yours." "Yes." "So there's no—" He stopped, started again. "The financial loss is yours to decide about. That's not what I'm—" He stopped again, put the summary document down on the desk and looked at her directly. "Claire, why didn't you tell me?" She'd thought about how to answer this. She'd thought about it for 2 days and hadn't entirely resolved it. "Because I was trying to make something that was mine," she said, "and telling you would have made it, part of everything else, part of this." She gestured slightly toward the office, toward the building around them. "I didn't want Nathan to be a project of Ashford Global. I wanted him to be my husband." Her father looked at her. "And the hiding." "The hiding was about him, not you. I didn't tell him because I didn't want him to feel—" She stopped, tried again. "Nathan had a specific self-understanding. He believed he had built something himself. I knew what that belief meant to him. And I—" She looked at the window. "I told myself I was protecting it. I think I was also afraid of what it would mean for us if he knew, if he understood how much of what he'd built had come from me." "What would it have meant?" "I don't know. I never found out." She looked back at her father. "That's one of the things I have to live with." Charles Ashford was quiet for a long time, long enough that Claire became aware of the building around them, the particular hum of an office tower coming to life in the morning, elevators moving, phones starting. "Gerald pulled Nathan Cross Architecture's current financials over the weekend," he said finally. His voice had shifted slightly, back toward the desk, toward the company. "The private loan. You were right about the timeline. The lender, a firm called Vantage Capital, has issued a formal notice of default. Nathan has 60 days. Claire felt something move through her. Not satisfaction exactly, something more complicated and less comfortable than that. "How much is the debt?" "The outstanding balance is $4.2 million. The company's assets, including the current project portfolio, are worth approximately 3 times that." He looked at her. "It's not an insolvent company. It's a company with a cash flow problem and a debt structure it can no longer service." "Which is the same problem it had at the beginning," Claire said, "when I fixed it the first time." "Yes." A pause. "I want to make an offer." "To acquire?" "To acquire the debt first from Vantage, then we'll see." Claire looked at the summary document on his desk. "On what terms?" "Fair terms. This isn't—" He paused. "I want to be clear about something. This is a business decision. The company has value. The acquisition makes structural sense for our development division. If it also corrects a record that needs correcting, that's secondary." "But it does correct the record." "Yes," he said. "It does." Claire thought about Nathan, about the version of Nathan that had stood in the lobby and looked away. She thought about the version of Nathan who had come home with a bottle of wine the night his firm opened, who had talked about architecture the way other people talked about things they'd die for. who had been genuinely, authentically talented in the specific ways that mattered to him, and who had spent 7 years building on a foundation he didn't know existed. "All right," she said, "but I want to be in the room." Her father looked at her. "When we meet with Nathan?" "Yes." He studied her for a moment. "That will be hard." "I know. For him, not just for you." "I know that too." He nodded once. "All right." He picked up the summary document again, looked at the first page. "I'll have Gerald begin the Vantage Capital approach this week, quietly." He looked up. The gala, the necklace, the woman. Sienna Blake. "She's still staying at the Mercer Hotel. Nathan's been paying for it." He said it without emphasis, just information. Claire thought about the diamonds, about the particular unhurried quality of that pour. "The necklace was purchased with Harmon Capital funds," she said. "Technically, it's—" She stopped. "Patricia Kwan will have thoughts on that," Charles said. "She will." Claire looked at the window. "I don't want the necklace. I want the record." "The record will be established." He set the document down. "Are you all right?" The question surprised her, not because he never asked it, but because of the timing, the way he'd set down the document and the business voice and just asked it plainly. "I'm better than I was a week ago," she said honestly. "That's something." "It is." He looked at her for another moment, and Claire saw something in his face she didn't often see. Not sentiment exactly. Her father was not a sentimental man, but something adjacent to it, something that looked like the long, quiet accumulation of worry finally finding a place to set itself down. "You should have told me," he said. Not accusing, just true. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you now." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. The meeting was shifting back toward business. She could feel it, the angle of his attention moving, and she was grateful for it, grateful that he understood when the personal portion of a conversation had reached its natural end, and that pressing further would cost more than it gave. "The borough president meeting is Friday the 15th, she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Marcus Webb's project?" "I'm going." He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile and was more than approval. "Good," he said. "It's been waiting long enough." The Meridian Foundation Gala had been on a Thursday. By the following Thursday, the architecture world's informal information network, which functioned with the speed and specificity of a well-organized gossip operation disguised as professional discourse, had generated 2 separate items of interest. The first was a short piece in an industry newsletter noting that Ashford Global had quietly made an approach to Vantage Capital regarding a private debt portfolio that included, among other positions, Nathan Cross Architecture's outstanding loan. The second was a longer profile, scheduled for publication in a widely read design journal, about Claire Ashford's appointment as incoming CEO of Ashford Global, a piece that had been commissioned 3 weeks earlier and whose timing, entirely by coincidence, now landed with a weight that had nothing to do with coincidence. Nathan Cross learned about the Vantage Capital approach on a Wednesday morning from his attorney, a man named Briggs, who had a gift for delivering terrible news with remarkable equanimity. "Ashford Global," Nathan said. He said it the way you say something when the word doesn't make sense in the sentence it's in. "That's correct," Briggs said. "Claire's, her father's company, yes." Nathan was quiet. Briggs waited, which was his professional style. "What does that mean?" Nathan said. Not a question exactly, more like a man trying to locate himself in a situation that had changed shape while he wasn't watching. "It means Ashford Global is in negotiation to purchase the Vantage Capital debt position. If they acquire it, they become your primary creditor." "And then what?" "That depends on what they want to do with it." Nathan was quiet again. Briggs waited again. "Is this—" Nathan started. He stopped. He looked at the surface of his desk, a beautiful piece, walnut and steel, that he'd had made by a craftsman in Brooklyn in the first flush of the firm's success, when money had seemed like something that accumulated naturally once you had the right address and the right clients. "Is this Claire?" Briggs considered this. The approach came from Gerald Marsh at Ashford Global. The decision to make it— He paused with the precision of a man who understood where the line was between answering a question and speculating. I can't tell you where that decision originated. Nathan stared at his desk. He thought about Thursday night. He'd been home when Sienna got back from wherever she'd gone after the gala. She'd stayed longer than he had come back animated and slightly pleased with herself in the way she got sometimes when something had gone the way she'd intended it to go. She told him about the interaction with Claire, told him the story the way she told most stories, with herself as its natural center, as the person doing the interesting thing, and Nathan had listened and not said anything and had gone to bed before her. He'd lain in the dark thinking about Claire's face when the champagne hit her shoe. The stillness of it. He'd seen Claire cry twice in 7 years of marriage. Once when her grandmother died, once during a bad fight in their 5th year that he still didn't like thinking about. And what he remembered about both times was that she'd cried the way she did most things, turned slightly away, composed about it. She didn't cry easily, and she didn't perform it when she did. What he'd seen at the gala was different, not tears. Claire standing with her hands at her sides and the champagne soaking through her shoe, looking at him across the lobby with an expression that he had told himself was nothing and that he now understood had been everything. She'd looked at him and he'd looked at the wall. He still wasn't entirely sure why. Fear, maybe. The specific fear of a person who has done something he knows was wrong and chooses absence over acknowledgement. It was not a flattering explanation, but he suspected it was the correct one. He thought about what Briggs was telling him, about Ashford Global, about Gerald Marsh, about Claire. "What are my options?" he said. Briggs walked him through them. They were not numerous and they were not comfortable. The 60-day default window was not extendable under the current loan terms. His cash position was genuinely bad. He'd known this, had been managing it with the specific tunnel vision optimism of someone who believes the next project will solve the problem the current project created. The firm's portfolio had value. He had real assets. But assets and cash flow were different things, and right now the difference was $4.2 million and 53 days. He listened to Briggs talk about his options and thought, with a clarity that was slightly nauseating, that he had been in this exact position once before, in the early days of the firm, in the first year, when the banks had said no 3 times, and he'd been looking at closing before he'd really opened. And then capital had appeared, and a bank had said yes on the 4th attempt, and he had thought he'd done it, thought he'd finally made it happen through sheer persistence and good projections. He had never once, in all the years since, stopped to ask where the capital had come from. It hadn't occurred to him to ask, and it should have. And he understood now, with the clarity that comes too late and at the worst possible time, that it should have. The Ashford Global Board meeting, where Claire formally presented the Harmon Capital documentation, was held on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks after the gala. She had not planned for it to be a board meeting. She had planned for it to be a smaller internal presentation to her father and Gerald and the company's legal team. But Charles had decided, without consulting her, that the board should hear it directly. She found this out Wednesday morning from Owen, who delivered the information with his characteristic understatement. "Your father moved the Harmon presentation to the full board," he said. "Friday, 3 o'clock. Claire looked at him. "He didn't mention that to me." "No," Owen said. He paused. "I think he wants it on record." She thought about this for a moment. She understood what her father was doing, not punishing her, not exposing her, but making sure that the documentation that established her role in Nathan Cross Architecture's development was heard by the people who would be overseeing Ashford Global's potential acquisition of that company. Making sure there was no possible ambiguity, now or later, about what had happened and why. It was, she had to admit, the correct decision. It was also the kind of decision that reminded her why Charles Ashford had built what he'd built, not just because he was smart, but because he understood that clarity, even when it was uncomfortable, was worth more than the discomfort it cost. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Owen." The board meeting was 12 people in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor. Claire stood at one end of the table with the summary document in front of her and the city visible behind her through the windows, and she went through all of it. The same account she'd given her father, the same account she'd given Patricia, but with the addition of the framework document Patricia had prepared, which laid out in legal language what the Harmon Capital records established and what they meant in the context of a potential acquisition. She spoke for 40 minutes. The room was quiet the entire time. When she finished, A board member named Harriet Eng, 60, sharp, the kind of woman who'd been underestimated at 40 and had been precise about not letting it happen again, looked up from the summary document and said, "These records are complete?" "Yes," Claire said. "Fully documented. No gaps in the transfer history. None. And the interventions involving third parties, the rezoning, the contractor settlements, those are documented with contemporaneous correspondence?" "Yes." Harriet looked at the document for a moment. "This establishes a material contribution to the enterprise value of Nathan Cross architecture." "That's Patricia Kwan's legal conclusion, yes." "And you've known this for how long?" Claire met her eyes. "I've known the facts since I was doing them. I understood their full implication approximately 2 months ago." Harriet held her gaze for a moment. She had the kind of directness that was completely devoid of cruelty, which Claire found both easier and harder to be looked at by than cruelty would have been. "All right," Harriet said, and looked back at the document. The rest of the questions were procedural. Timeline of the Vantage Capital approach, structure of the potential acquisition offer, what Ashford Global's integration plan would look like if the acquisition went through. Claire answered them all. Her voice was steady throughout. She was aware, in some distant part of herself, that this was the first time she had stood in a room full of powerful people and spoken clearly about something she had done without minimizing it or redirecting credit or performing the kind of self-effacement that had been, for a very long time, her primary mode of being. She was also aware that the thing she was speaking about was a period of her life she was not proud of, not because she had done wrong exactly, but because she had hidden herself in it, and the hiding had cost her more than anything the hiding had been meant to protect. When it was over, when the board had concluded its session and the room was clearing, her father caught her arm briefly at the door. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed her arm once and let go. She walked to her office and sat down behind her desk and looked at the city. Her phone showed a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't return it. Then she looked at it again and something made her dial. It rang twice. Then Nathan Cross said, "Claire." She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. Outside, Manhattan was doing what it always did, operating at full volume, completely indifferent to the specific weight of any individual moment occurring within it. "Nathan," she said. A pause. "I need to talk to you." "I know. Not about the company, or not only about the company." Another pause. She could hear him breathing, which was something she hadn't heard in over a year, and it was strange in the specific way that all the ordinary details of a person you used to know are strange once you're no longer close enough to encounter them. "I didn't know," he said. "About Harmon. I didn't. Claire, I need you to know that I didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said. "I never told you. But I should have. I should have asked more. Where the seed capital came from, the hotel project. I should have." He stopped. "I built my whole career on something I didn't understand." Claire thought about what to say. She thought about the kitchen sink, about the cold water, about a dinner party where her name hadn't appeared in the afterword. She thought about the lobby of the Harrington Tower, about the thing that had moved through her when she finally understood that she was going to stop being invisible. "You built your career on real talent," she said. "That part was always yours." A silence. "That's..." He stopped. "That's generous." "It's true," she said. Not generously, just accurately. "The work was good, Nathan. That was never the part that was wrong." Another silence, longer. "I'm sorry about Thursday night," he said. "At the gala. I should have..." "Yes," she said simply. Not harshly, just yes. He was quiet. "You looked..." He stopped again. She could hear him working out how to say something. "When you walked back out into the lobby later, with your father, you looked like yourself, like who you actually are. I don't know if I ever..." He didn't finish the sentence. Claire looked at her desk, at the site plan for the South Bronx corridor that Marcus had left with her on Friday, spread at the corner of the desk, full of margins and notes. "We'll need to meet," she said. "Formally. About the company. Your attorney and mine, and then probably us. That conversation has to happen." "I know. This isn't that conversation." "I know that too." A pause. Is this? He seemed to be trying to find a version of the question he could actually ask. Are you all right? Claire thought about it. She looked at the city outside her window. She thought about the alcove, the compact mirror, the steadiness she'd found there and hadn't lost since. Yes, she said, I am. She meant it in a way she hadn't meant it when she'd said it to her father over the phone 3 months ago, in the temporary apartment with the furniture that wasn't hers. She meant it the way you mean something when you've tested it against enough difficulty to trust it. Good, Nathan said, and then, very quietly, good. She said goodbye and set the phone down. She sat in her office as the afternoon light shifted, as the city moved through its Friday routines outside the glass, and thought about 60 days, about Vantage Capital and 4.2 million and the particular machinery of institutional accountability doing what it was built to do, not rushing, not performing drama, just moving with the slow, irresistible weight of documented reality. She pulled the South Bronx site plan toward her and picked up a pen. She had a meeting with the borough president in 8 days. She had work to do. The meeting with the Bronx borough president went better than expected and worse than Claire had hoped, which was roughly how most things worth doing went. The borough president's name was Diane Reyes, early 50s, compact and deliberate, with the particular manner of someone who had spent 20 years watching developers make promises in this office and had developed a precise internal calibration for the difference between the ones who meant it and the ones who were performing meaning it. She shook Claire's hand with the grip of someone who paid attention to that kind of thing and directed her to a chair across from a desk covered in folders and a coffee mug that said Bronx Born and had been used many hundreds of times without being washed quite enough. Owen sat beside Claire. Marcus Webb sat on her other side with the site plan rolled up under his arm, which Claire had told him to leave in the tube, and he'd agreed, and he'd brought it anyway. She didn't say anything about it. Diane Reyes looked at the three of them and said, I've been waiting 8 months for Ashford Global to come back to this table. I know, Claire said. I'm sorry it took this long. Are you? Yes. Diane looked at her with the specific evaluating attention of someone taking a person's measure. What changed? I did, Claire said. I came back to the company 2 months ago. This project was the first thing I picked up. Why? Because it matters, and because the delay was embarrassing. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I appreciate the candor, in a tone that suggested she'd been expecting something else and was recalibrating accordingly. She looked at Marcus. Mr. Webb, your proposal includes resident input at the schematic phase. Yes, Marcus said. Most developers propose that and then find reasons not to do it once the project gets moving. I know. We're proposing it as a contractual commitment. If you want it in the term sheet, it goes in the term sheet. Diane looked at Claire. Is that the company's position? It is, Claire said. The meeting ran 40 minutes over its scheduled hour. Claire left with a cautious agreement to proceed to the next stage of community engagement, a list of concerns from Diane's office that needed addressing in the revised proposal, and a handshake that felt like it had been considered before it was extended. In the elevator going down, Marcus said, She liked you. She was evaluating me, Claire said. Same thing with Diane Reyes. He looked at the elevator doors. The last time I was in that office, the VP sent an associate who kept checking his phone. She hasn't forgotten. I assumed. This is different. He said it simply, not as flattery, just as an observation. Claire looked at the elevator doors. Make sure the contractual language on the community input is airtight before we go back, she said. If we're putting it in the term sheet, I want it to mean something. I'll have a draft by Wednesday. The elevator opened to the lobby. Outside, the Bronx was doing what it always did, busy, unimpressed, functioning at its own frequency regardless of what the people in the building above it were deciding about it. Claire stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt the cold air and thought about the site plan and the housing that would go on it eventually, the actual physical fact of buildings where people would live, and found that the thought gave her something that most of the things she'd done in her working life had not. A clean, uncomplicated sense of purpose. Not everything felt like that. She was learning to notice when something did. Come on. The Vantage Capital negotiation concluded on a Thursday, 29 days after Gerald Marsh had made the initial approach. Claire was in her office when Gerald appeared in the doorway at 4:17 in the afternoon with the expression he wore when delivering news he'd already processed and was now ready for her to process. "It's done," he said. "Ashford Global holds the debt." Claire set down the revised community engagement framework she'd been reading. "What were the final terms?" Gerald told her. They were clean. Vantage had been motivated sellers. The Nathan Cross position was one of several in a private portfolio they were restructuring, and Ashford Global's offer had been fair and fast, which was often the combination that mattered more than price. "And Nathan's attorney has been notified?" she said. "Briggs received the formal notice at 3 o'clock. Claire thought about Nathan on the phone 3 weeks ago, the quiet way he'd said good twice at the end of their conversation. She thought about the 53 days that had been counting down from the moment Briggs had told him about the default notice. Now the clock had stopped and a different clock had started, one whose terms were Ashford Global's to set. "What does my father want to do with the acquisition offer?" she said. "He wants to hear from you first." She had known he would. She'd been thinking about it since the board meeting, turning it over in the way she turned over complicated things, not obsessively, but steadily, returning to it at intervals, letting her understanding of it deepen without forcing a conclusion. She thought about what Nathan had built, not the mythology of it, not the self-made story he'd been living inside for 7 years, but the actual work. The Chelsea Hotel, which was genuinely beautiful, a renovation that had taken a graceless building and given it a logic that made you feel it had always wanted to be exactly what it became. A community center in Queens that she'd driven past once without knowing it was his and had thought, with the professional part of her mind that was always running, whoever designed this understood the people who would use it. A residential complex in Jersey City that had won a regional design award and that Marcus Webb had mentioned once offhandedly as the kind of work that reminded you why the field was worth being in. Nathan Cross was genuinely talented. She had always known this. She had also, for 7 years, been the invisible infrastructure underneath that talent, and she was no longer in the business of being invisible. But she also was not in the business of destruction. She picked up the phone and called her father. "I want to make him an offer," she said when he answered. "Not a punitive one, a real one." Charles was quiet for a moment. "What kind of offer?" "Acquisition of the company, full integration into Ashford Global's development division. He stays on as lead architect. His name stays on the work." She paused. "The terms make clear what the Harmon Capital records establish. He signs an acknowledgement. That's not negotiable." "The acknowledgement. Yes. I'm not asking for more than that. I'm asking for the record to be accurate." Her father was quiet for longer this time. She could hear him thinking, not literally, but she knew his thinking silences from his other silences, and this was one of them. "That's a fair offer," he said finally. "I know. He may not see it that way initially. I know that too, but Briggs will explain the alternatives." She paused. "I don't want to take his company and shut it down. I want to take it and let it keep doing good work, under Ashford Global, with accurate records. And with you as his employer." "Yes." She let that sit for a moment. "That's going to be uncomfortable." "Considerably." "I know." She looked at the site plan on her desk. "But the work is good, and the people working there didn't do anything wrong. 12 employees. I don't want to burn 12 people's livelihoods down because of a dynamic between me and my ex-husband." "That's," her father paused, "that's the right way to think about it." "I know." She said it without pride. It was just the correct position, and she'd worked out that it was the correct position, and that was what mattered. "I'll have Gerald prepare the offer document," Charles said. "We'll send it through attorneys. You'll want Patricia on your side of the table when it's time to negotiate." Already planned. After she hung up, she sat for a long moment in her office, in the growing dark of a late November afternoon, thinking about accuracy, about what it meant to insist on it. She hadn't come to this decision easily. There had been 2 nights in the past 3 weeks when she'd woken up at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark turning over the question of what she actually wanted, and the honest answer had been complicated and not always flattering. She had wanted, at certain moments, for Nathan to lose, to have the thing taken away and to know it had been taken, to feel the removal of what he'd believed was entirely his. She had felt that, and she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't. It was a human thing to feel after what had happened, after 7 years and the gala and the looking away, and she had sat with the feeling and let it exist without acting on it. Because the other thing she had wanted, the thing underneath the simpler want, was for the truth to be visible, not for Nathan to be destroyed, for the truth to be visible. Those were different things, and she'd needed the 3 weeks to understand how different they were. But Sienna Blake's Instagram had been quiet for 12 days. Claire knew this because Lena Park had mentioned it in passing during a team meeting. Not maliciously, Lena was not malicious. She was simply precise and paid attention to things. And Claire had not commented on it, but she had noted it. 12 days of silence from someone whose entire income structure depended on daily content was not nothing. It was the sound of something recalibrating. She found out what had happened from a source she hadn't expected. Margaret, her stepmother, who called on a Sunday afternoon while Claire was reading and who delivered information the way she delivered most things, with care and without editorializing. "I heard something you might want to know," Margaret said, "from Donna Kessler." "You know Donna." Claire did. Donna Kessler was a woman of considerable social reach who knew everything about everyone in their particular orbit and considered this knowledge a form of public service. "What did Donna hear?" Claire said. "That Sienna Blake moved out of the Mercer 2 weeks ago. Apparently she went back to Ohio." Claire put her book down. "Ohio. That's where she's from originally. Her family is there." A pause. "Nathan stopped paying for the hotel." Claire thought about this. Not with satisfaction exactly. It was more complicated than that. It always was. She thought about Sienna on Thursday night at the gala, the specific performance of that evening, the way Sienna had moved through the lobby as though it was a set built for her, and she was its natural protagonist. She thought about someone who had built an entire version of herself for an audience of over 1 million people, and what it felt like when the version stopped holding. "Is she all right?" Claire said. A small pause. "That's a generous question. I'm genuinely asking." "I don't know," Margaret said. "Donna didn't know either, just that she'd gone home." Claire sat with that for a moment. She wasn't going to perform compassion she didn't feel. She wasn't there, not fully, not yet, maybe not ever, but she also wasn't going to manufacture satisfaction from someone else's difficulty. The gala had been what it was. The champagne had been what it was. And now Sienna Blake was in Ohio, and Claire was sitting in her own apartment on a Sunday afternoon with a book and a life that was actually hers, and the accounting of who had what seemed clear enough to her without needing to add anything to it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Of course." A pause. "Claire, come for dinner next week. Your father won't say so directly, but he'd like it." "Wednesday?" "Wednesday is good, Shaz." Nathan Cross received the formal acquisition offer from Ashford Global on a Monday morning through Briggs, who called him into the office for what he described as an important conversation and who had his own copy of the offer document already annotated when Nathan arrived. Nathan sat across from Briggs and read the offer. He read it slowly, which was not his usual manner. He was a person who processed information quickly and moved fast, had always been. It was part of what made him effective in rooms where decisions needed to happen. But he read this slowly, the way you read something when you understand that the pace at which you process it will affect what you do with it. The terms were fair. He could see that immediately, even through the first layer of resistance that activated in him when he understood what he was reading. Ashford Global was offering full value for the company's current portfolio plus a reasonable premium. His name would remain on the firm's work. He would operate as lead architect within the Ashford Global Development Division with a structured salary and a project-based bonus arrangement. The debt, the $4.2 million, the thing that had been counting down for 53 days, would be absorbed in the acquisition. There was an acknowledgement document attached. He read it twice. It laid out, in clear legal language, the history of Harmon Capital's involvement in Nathan Cross architecture, the seed investment, the hotel project, the contractor settlements, the rezoning facilitation, the post-separation distributions. It described the material contribution these interventions had made to the development and survival of the firm. It asked Nathan to sign that he had read and understood the document and that he did not contest its factual accuracy. That was all. No admission of wrongdoing, no financial penalty, no public statement required. Just a signature confirming that the facts were the facts. Briggs watched him read. When Nathan set the document down, Briggs said, "It's a fair offer." "I know," Nathan said. "Given the alternatives, I know what the alternatives are." Nathan looked at the acknowledgement document. "She's not asking for anything else." "No, just the signature." "That's correct." Nathan looked at the offer for a long time. He thought about 7 years of his career, about the projects he'd built, the reputation he'd developed, the specific texture of the work that he had genuinely loved doing even when everything around it was complicated. He thought about the seed capital appearing at exactly the right moment, about the hotel stop work order lifting 11 days after it had seemed immovable, about the contractor dispute that had resolved cleanly when he'd been certain it wouldn't. He had taken all of these things as evidence of his own persistence and had never once examined them closely enough to see the shape of something else behind them. He thought about Claire at the kitchen sink with cold water. He thought about the lobby of the Harrington Tower and the look on her face when he'd turned away. He thought about the phone call 3 weeks ago, her voice steady and clear, saying, "You built your career on real talent. That part was always yours." He didn't deserve that. He knew he didn't deserve it, and she'd said it anyway. And the fact that she'd said it anyway was doing something complicated to him that he hadn't finished processing. "I need a few days," he said. "Of course." Briggs paused. "Nathan, the offer has a 10-day window." "I know." He picked up the acknowledgement document. "This is the part she actually wanted." Briggs considered his words carefully. "I think that's probably accurate. Not the acquisition, not the company, the acknowledgement. The legal and financial structure required the acquisition to make sense," Briggs said. "But yes, I think the acknowledgement is... I think it matters to her." Nathan set the document down. He looked at the offer. He looked at Briggs's annotated copy across the desk. He thought about what it meant to sign something that said, "I have read the account of what was done for me without my knowledge, and I do not contest that it is true." It meant he had to know it, fully, on paper, with his signature attached. It meant he could never again, not to himself, not to anyone, maintain the story of what he had built entirely on his own. "I'll be back to you by Thursday," he said. He left Briggs's office and walked 17 blocks back to his own, which he never did. He always took a cab, but which he needed to do today, needed the specific experience of the city under his feet, the cold air, the noise of it, the way New York functioned at full volume regardless of what any individual person was working through inside it. He walked through Midtown and thought about the acknowledgement. By the time he reached his building, he already knew he was going to sign it. He'd known it before he left Briggs's office, probably. He just needed the 17 blocks to finish knowing it. Yet, he signed it on Wednesday. Briggs called Claire's attorney the same afternoon. The full acquisition agreement went to signatures the following Monday. Claire was in a meeting with Marcus and the community engagement team when Owen knocked and came in with a piece of paper he set in front of her. Not a full document, just a note in Owen's handwriting. Signed. All parties. Done. She looked at it for a moment. Marcus and the rest of the team were talking about the community board session scheduled for December, and she listened to them and made 3 notes on her own copy of the agenda, and asked a question about the environmental supplement that Marcus answered thoroughly, and that led to a 15-minute discussion that was genuinely useful. At the end of the meeting, after everyone else had filed out, Marcus paused at the door. He'd noticed the note. She could tell from the way he'd glanced at it when Owen brought it in. "Everything okay?" he said. "Yes," Claire said. "Everything's okay." He nodded and left. She sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. She looked at the note. She thought about 7 years and 43 pages, and a summary document presented to a boardroom and an acknowledgement signed on a Wednesday in Briggs's office, 2 months after a night in a marble lobby when champagne had soaked through a navy satin heel. She thought about the woman she'd seen in the compact mirror in the alcove. She thought about what it had taken to get to her, all the particular accumulation of choices and concealments and quiet erasures, and then the slow, difficult process of undoing them, of standing up in rooms and saying true things about herself without softening them for other people's comfort. She had not done all of that perfectly. She had made decisions in the last 2 months that she would revisit over the years and evaluate differently at different times. The Harmon Capital records. What to do with them. How to use institutional weight as the instrument of correction rather than something more direct. There would be people who thought she'd been too careful, too measured, not angry enough. There would be people who thought she'd been unnecessarily punitive. She had made the best decision she could with the values she had and the information available to her, and she would live with it and revise her thinking as new information came, and that was all anyone could do. She picked up the note, folded it once, put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. She went back to her office and worked until 7, which was later than she meant to and earlier than the work strictly required. And then she put on her coat and took the elevator down and walked out into the December evening. The city was lit up for the season, lights in the trees along the avenue, the particular quality of December light in New York that had always done something to her chest that she'd never been able to fully explain. She walked half a block and stopped at a corner and looked up and saw the Ashford Global building 2 blocks north, its top floors lit against the dark sky. She thought about her father lifting her onto a concrete ledge in an unfinished lobby so she could see the view. She thought about the South Bronx site plan rolled out across her conference table, about families who would eventually live in buildings that didn't exist yet, on land that currently had nothing on it, and about the community meetings where people who lived near that land would have a real say in what got built, not performative input, contractual input. Diane Reyes had made sure of that, and Marcus had made sure of that, and Claire had made sure of it too. She thought about Sienna Blake in Ohio and hoped she was okay, and meant it even though it cost her something to mean it. She thought about Nathan sitting in Briggs's office on a Wednesday morning, reading an acknowledgement of facts he'd spent 7 years not knowing, and signing his name to the understanding that the story he'd told about himself had a chapter he hadn't written. She hoped he'd find his way back to the work, the actual work, the Chelsea Hotel, the Queens Community Center, the Jersey City Complex. Those were good. Those were his. And the thing about genuine talent was that it didn't disappear when the mythology around it did. She hoped he understood that now. She started walking again. The cold was the kind that cleared your head rather than just making you uncomfortable, and she was grateful for it, for the particular clarity of December air and her own feet on the pavement, and the very ordinary experience of being a person moving through a city that had no particular feelings about her in either direction. The buildings rose on both sides of the avenue, lit against the dark. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Webb. Community Board confirmed December 12th. They want to hear from you directly. She typed back, I'll be there. She put the phone away and walked. She was 2 blocks from her apartment when she passed a small restaurant she hadn't been to in years. Italian, old school, the kind that still had checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles, and had somehow survived 30 years in a neighborhood that had turned over 4 times around it. She'd eaten there once on a first date that had not gone particularly well, and once with her grandmother on a rainy Tuesday, and once with Nathan in the 3rd year of their marriage, when things were still good enough that dinner alone felt like a thing worth choosing instead of a thing you did because you'd run out of other options. She stood in front of it for a moment. She went in. The host recognized her, not as Claire Ashford, just as someone who had been there before, which was its own kind of thing, and gave her a table by the window without her asking. She ordered the things she'd ordered the night with her grandmother and a glass of wine she didn't finish, and sat by the window watching the street outside and thought about nothing in particular for almost an hour, which was something she'd had very little practice doing and which she was starting to understand, going to need to get better at. The woman at the table by the window on a December evening in a restaurant with checkered tablecloths was not a finished person. Claire had no illusions about that. She was a person who had spent a long time making herself smaller than she was, and who was now, slowly and not always gracefully, learning what the larger version of herself required. That process was not going to be tidy. She was going to make decisions she'd regret, and have days where the clarity of the alcove felt very far away, and sit across from people who had underestimated her and feel the old pull to correct downward, to make it easier for them, to take up less space. She was going to have to keep deciding not to do that, every time. She paid the check and left. Outside, the city was full and loud and cold and entirely itself. She put her hands in her pockets and walked the last 2 blocks home. The community board meeting on December 12th ran 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than scheduled, and in Diane Reyes's estimation, a good sign. Claire stood at the front of a meeting room in a community center in the South Bronx that smelled like old coffee and floor wax and had fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. And she answered questions for most of those 2 hours and 40 minutes. Not Owen, not Marcus, though Marcus answered the technical ones about site planning and structural specs, with the focused competence of someone who had been waiting a long time to be in this room. Claire answered the ones that weren't technical, the ones about why Ashford Global had waited 8 months, about what the community input commitment actually meant in practice, about what happened when what residents wanted and what the company's numbers required came into conflict. That last question came from a man in the third row named Gerald Hicks, 60s, retired, with the particular wariness of someone who had lived in this neighborhood through several cycles of developers arriving with promises, who asked it plainly and waited. Claire didn't reach for the polished answer. She thought about it for a moment, the real moment of thought visible on her face, and then said, "I won't tell you there'll never be tension between those things. There will be. What I can tell you is that the community input is in the contract, which means when there's tension, it has to be negotiated, not overridden. That's different from most arrangements. I know it's not everything, but it's real." Gerald Hicks looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said, not warm, not sold, but willing to continue. Diane Reyes, sitting in the back row with her arms folded and her expression giving nothing away, made a small note on her pad. Afterward, in the parking lot, Marcus exhaled a long breath into the cold air and looked at Claire. "That went okay?" he said. "It went okay," she agreed. "Gerald Hicks hasn't said all right to a developer in 15 years. "That's a low bar, Marcus. It's the bar we had." He tucked the site plan tube under his arm. "December timeline is going to be tight for the revised proposal." "I know, we'll make it." She drove back to the office with Owen, who sat in the passenger seat and looked at his phone and said, at one point, without looking up, "You handled that well." "Thank you." "Particularly the tension question." "I almost lied," she said. He looked up then. "Not dramatically," she said. "I almost gave the smooth version, said something about how the community's vision and our financial model were fundamentally aligned." She glanced at him. "They're not, always. That would have been the wrong thing to say." Owen looked at her for a moment. "Most people in your position would have said it anyway." "I know." He went back to his phone. Claire drove and thought about the fluorescent light in that meeting room, about Gerald Hicks's face when she'd given him the honest answer instead of the comfortable one, about the specific quality of an all right that meant I'm still watching, but I haven't left. That was enough. That was in fact exactly enough. January arrived with the specific indifference of a New York winter that had no interest in the significance anyone attached to a new year. Claire worked. She worked the way she'd been working since October, with focus and without performance, without the constant lateral awareness she'd spent 7 years developing, the habit of monitoring how the room was receiving her, whether she was taking up too much space, whether the thing she was about to say would cost more than it gave. That habit was not gone. She didn't want to overstate her own transformation. The habit was still there, the old reflex, and there were meetings where she felt it activate and had to make a conscious choice to speak anyway, to let the sentence exist at its full length without editing it down to something easier. But the choice was available to her now in a way it hadn't always been. That was the difference. Not the absence of the old pattern, but the presence of something that could override it. The South Bronx proposal went to the City Council on January 19th. Claire presented alongside Marcus and a community liaison named Yolanda Torres, who had been involved in the resident engagement sessions that Marcus had run through December, and who spoke about what the project meant to the people who would live near it with the kind of directness that made 3 council members look up from their phones. The vote was 5-2 in favor of proceeding to the next approval stage. Claire called her father from the cab going back to the office. 5-2, she said. A pause. Then, "Good. Marcus deserves most of the credit." "You went to the borough president meeting," her father said, "and the community board, and you presented today. That's not the same as 7 years of work on the proposal." "No," he said. "It's different work. Both matter. She looked out the cab window at the January city. Are you going to tell me I did a good job? I'm telling you the vote was 5-2 and now we build something real. That's the same thing. Is it? She smiled at the window. Yes. He made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Charles Ashford got in professional contexts. Come for dinner Sunday. Margaret is making the lamb. I'll be there. But she met Adrian Brooks in February at a lunch hosted by the Meridian Foundation, the same organization whose gala had started all of this, which was the kind of circular thing that life did sometimes without being particularly subtle about it. The lunch was smaller than the gala, a working session for nonprofit leaders and private sector partners around affordable housing and urban infrastructure. And Claire was there because Ashford Global had become, in the past 3 months, an organization people associated with actually trying to do something real in that space, rather than just attending events about it. Adrian Brooks ran a nonprofit called New Ground that did community development work in underserved neighborhoods across 3 boroughs. He was 41, medium height, with an unhurried manner and the kind of listening attention that Claire noticed because she'd been learning to pay attention to who actually listened and who was just waiting for their turn. He asked her questions about the Bronx Project that were specific and practical, not the polite questions of someone performing interest, but the questions of someone who understood the material and wanted to know what she'd learned. They talked through lunch and then through the part after lunch when most people had moved to the networking portion of the afternoon that was really just standing with coffee cups trying to look purposeful. The community input clause, he said. You put it in the contract. Yes. How'd you get your board to agree to that? I told them we weren't going forward without it. He looked at her. That's simple. It wasn't simple, she said. But that's what I said. He nodded slowly. We've been trying to get 3 developers to commit to that kind of language for 2 years. None of them will do it. It's a liability question for most of them. They're afraid of being contractually bound to a process that could slow timelines. It will slow timelines. Yes, she said. Sometimes. It'll also produce better buildings that communities actually use, which improves long-term value, which is an argument I had to make 4 times before it landed. She paused. The first version of the argument was about ethics. That didn't work. The second version was about reputation. That worked better. The third version was about 10-year asset performance. That's the one that closed it. Adrian Brooks looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not admiration exactly, something more like recognition, the look of someone who has been in enough rooms to know how they actually work, and who has found someone else who also knows. Can I call you? He said, about New Ground's approach to the developer conversations. I think there might be something worth thinking through together. Yes, she said. She gave him her card. He looked at it for a moment. Claire Ashford, CEO, Ashford Global, and put it in his jacket pocket with the care of someone who didn't lose things. She drove back to the office and told no one about the conversation, and thought about it occasionally over the next few days with the cautious, non-committal attention she gave to things she wasn't ready to categorize yet. He called on Thursday. They talked for an hour about New Ground's methodology and Ashford Global's community engagement framework, and discovered 3 places where the 2 organizations could do useful work together that neither could do as efficiently alone. They scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following week. At the end of the call, he said, I have to tell you something. All right. I was at the Meridian Gala in November. Claire went still. Were you? I was in the lobby when... He paused. I saw what happened with the champagne. She was quiet for a moment. And? I thought about saying something. I didn't. I didn't know you, and I wasn't sure it would help. A pause. I've thought about that since, whether I should have. Claire considered this. She thought about the lobby, about the circle of people who had laughed, about the ones who hadn't laughed but hadn't moved either. She thought about what she'd felt in those seconds before she turned to walk away. Not only humiliation, but the specific loneliness of a room that had decided to watch. You couldn't have fixed it, she said. But, yes, it would have been something if someone had just... She stopped. It doesn't matter now. No, but I wanted to say it. She appreciated that he had. She didn't say so, but she appreciated it. Next Thursday, she said. 2 o'clock. I'll be there, he said. Nathan Cross started at Ashford Global's development division on the first Monday of February, 6 weeks after the acquisition closed. His first day was not triumphant. Claire hadn't expected it to be and had not staged anything to make it easier or harder than it was. He had a desk, an office, a project manager assigned to him, and a clear brief on the 3 projects his team would be absorbing from Claire's development pipeline. She saw him in the hallway on his way to a meeting with Marcus. He looked like himself. Good suit, slightly tired around the eyes, the expression of a man who understood the particular geometry of his current situation and had decided to stand inside it anyway. "Morning," he said. "Morning?" she said. He kept walking. She kept walking. That was all. It was strange, and it was also, she realized, the right kind of strange. The kind that came from 2 people agreeing without discussion that the professional context was the professional context and that everything else was everything else, and that the only way to make any of this work was to let those 2 things be separate. Marcus mentioned him at the end of their weekly check-in 2 weeks into February. Not the situation, just the work. "Nathan's been good on the Riverdale project," he said, in the same tone he'd used to describe any colleague. "He caught a structural issue in the schematic phase that would have cost us 3 weeks in revisions." "Good," Claire said. He asked good questions in the community session Wednesday. "Good." Marcus looked at her for a moment. "Is this going to be weird?" he said. "It's already weird," she said. "We're doing it anyway." He nodded. "Okay," he said, and moved on to the next item on the agenda. She respected that about Marcus. He didn't make more of things than they were. He just worked. The conversation with Nathan that she had been not avoiding arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March. Not by appointment, but by the logic of 2 people who worked in the same building, eventually finding themselves alone in a conference room after everyone else had left a meeting that had run long. It was the Riverdale project review, and when the last person filed out, Nathan was still at the table looking at a site rendering, and Claire was still at the table with her laptop, and neither of them immediately moved. He spoke first. "I looked at the Harmon Capital records," he said. "The full documentation. Patricia Kwan's framework." She hadn't known he'd done this. "When?" "Before I signed. I asked Briggs to get me the full set." He looked at the rendering. "I wanted to understand it, all of it, not just sign the acknowledgement because I had to." Claire closed her laptop. "The hotel project," he said. "The stop work order. I know what I told myself at the time, that I'd pushed through it, that persistence had fixed it. But looking at the timeline in the documentation, the dates, I can see—" He stopped. "It was resolved 11 days after I'd been completely unable to move it for 3 weeks. That's not persistence." "No," she said. "That's someone who knew someone." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was the question she'd asked herself. She had a few answers to it by now. "Because I knew what it would mean to you," she said. "What it would do to how you understood what you were building. So you protected me from it." "I thought I was. At the time." She looked at the rendering he'd been studying, a clean design, elegant, with the specific economy of someone who understood that good architecture was about what you left out as much as what you put in. Later, I understood that I was also protecting myself from having the conversation, from having to say out loud what I was doing and why, because if I said it out loud, I'd have to look at it. "And what would you have seen?" She thought about this. It was the kind of question that deserved a careful answer, and Nathan, whatever else he was, had always been capable of a careful conversation when he chose to have one. "I would have seen that I was making myself indispensable in ways that were invisible," she said. "And that being invisible suited me. Not fully. I didn't want to be invisible exactly, but I'd grown up in a very large shadow and I'd made choices to get out of it, and some of those choices folded back on themselves in ways I didn't recognize until it was too late." Nathan looked at the rendering for a long moment. "I was not a good husband to you," he said. "No. I don't mean only the obvious thing. I mean, long before Sienna, I stopped paying attention." He said it without drama, without the performance of remorse that would have made it easier to dismiss. Just the plain assessment of a person who'd had enough time alone with a true thing to have stopped flinching at it. You were doing all of that, and I wasn't asking questions because asking questions would have meant paying attention, and I was very focused on my own story. Claire looked at him. She thought about the dinner party, about cold water in the sink, about the particular sound of his voice saying it all just came together to someone on the phone while she washed dishes 10 feet away.
"Yes," she said. "I'm sorry, Claire." She had thought about this moment, not planned it. She hadn't known it was coming on a Thursday in March in a conference room with a site rendering between them, but she'd thought about what she would feel when Nathan said the words, if he said them in whatever form they came. She felt something. Not relief. Relief would have been too simple. Something more like the settling of a thing that had been slightly off balance, a small structural correction. Not a resolution of everything, not the closing of something that had taken years to open, but the acknowledgement of a real truth by the one other person who had lived inside it. "I know," she said. She meant it as more than a deflection. She meant, "I believe you. I accept this." "That's more than I deserve," he said. "Probably," she said. And then, because it was also true, "But you're doing good work here. The Riverdale catch was real." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not gratitude exactly, not quite. Something more complex than that. The expression of a person who has been handed back a version of himself that doesn't require him to be entirely defined by his worst moments. "I'm trying to get back to just the work," he said. That's what I was always good at. The rest of it." He shook his head slightly. "The rest of it got too big." "I know," she said, and then, "The rest of it always does for a while." He picked up his folder, stood. At the door he paused with the particular pause she recognized from the phone call in November, the pause of someone with one more thing they haven't quite finished saying. "She's doing better," he said. "Sienna, she's back in Ohio. She's been working with her family's business, small stuff." He paused. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because you wanted me to know she wasn't broken," Claire said, "and because you're not entirely sure you have the right to care about that, given everything." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Something like that." "She'll be all right," Claire said. "People usually are." He left. Claire sat in the conference room for a few minutes after. She looked at the site rendering on the table. She thought about the particular quality of that conversation, its imperfection, its incompleteness, the things that hadn't been resolved by it because they couldn't be resolved, the things that had been. Not every wound closes. Some of them just become part of the landscape, present but no longer bleeding, something you navigate around with enough practice that the navigation becomes ordinary. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. Adrienne Brooks became a fixture in her professional life through March. And then in April, something shifted in a way that was gradual enough that neither of them marked a specific moment, but both eventually noticed. He was not like Nathan. This was the first thing Claire had registered and then put aside as irrelevant, and then returned to as something that mattered. He was not like Nathan in specific ways. Not the performance of certainty, not the orientation toward his own story, not the tendency to move quickly through rooms as though the rooms existed to facilitate his arrival and departure. Adrienne moved differently. He arrived in places and seemed to actually be there. He also made mistakes. He was late to 2 of their first 4 meetings and arrived both times with the specific face of someone who knew exactly how late he was and hadn't manufactured an excuse on the way over. He had strong opinions about urban development policy that were sometimes right and sometimes more idealistic than the material reality of how cities actually worked. And when Claire pushed back with evidence, he'd get quiet and then argue and then, if her evidence held, concede. Not gracefully, not with the ease of someone who'd made a practice of concession, but genuinely with the slight discomfort of someone updating a position they'd held for a while. She found that quality, the visible difficulty of changing his mind, more reassuring than easy agreement would have been. In April, they had dinner after a meeting that ran until 7:30, because the meeting had started at 5:30 and covered 3 separate partnership proposals, and by the end of it, they were both hungry and the conversation was still going. They ate at a Thai place near Claire's office that was not romantic and was good,
and they talked about Newground's expansion plans and Ashford Global's second Bronx proposal and a conference in Chicago in June that they'd both been invited to speak at separately, and that now, over pad see edu and green curry, became a thing they acknowledged they'd both be at. At some point, the professional conversation became a different kind of conversation. Claire wasn't sure exactly when, but she noticed it when Adrian asked her something that had nothing to do with either of their organizations. "What did you do before all this?" he said. "Not the company, before you came back to it." She thought about how to answer. "I was in a marriage that required me to be smaller than I was," she said. "And I did it voluntarily, which is the part I've spent the most time with." He didn't rush to respond. He looked at his food and then at her and said, "What made you stop?" "A woman poured champagne on my shoes in front of 200 people," she said, "and the person who should have done something didn't." He looked at her steadily. "That specific?" "That specific." She paused. "But the champagne was just the last thing. The real answer is that I came back to a place I understood, and the understanding reminded me of who I actually was." She picked up her water glass. "That's harder to explain than the champagne." "No," he said. "That's the clearest version of it." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the attention she'd noticed in the Meridian lunchroom in February, not the social performance of interest, but the actual thing, present and uncalculating. "You're going to be at the Chicago conference," she said. "I am. We should have dinner there too." He smiled. It was a good smile. Nothing performed about it, just a person glad about something. "Yes," he said. "We should." June in Chicago was warm and overcast, the lake doing the thing it did in early summer, that peculiar gray-blue that looked like it belonged to a different, older city than the one built up around it. Claire arrived a day before the conference and walked along the waterfront in the evening and thought about the 8 months since November. 8 months was not a long time in the way certain kinds of change were usually measured. She was aware of that. She didn't feel transformed. She felt like herself, more fully than she had in a long time, but not remade from the ground up. Not the heroine of a story where clarity arrived complete and permanent and never required maintenance. She still had days where the old reflex fired, where she caught herself editing a thought before she said it, softening a position she didn't actually want to soften, reading the room for permission before speaking. She still had mornings where the weight of 7 years felt less like something she'd moved through and more like something she was still carrying. She didn't think that was going to disappear entirely, and she had stopped expecting it to. But she also had the Bronx Project, now approved through 3 stages of city review and scheduled to break ground in September. She had a team, Marcus and Owen and Lena and Yolanda, and 12 other people who showed up and worked and had started, she'd noticed recently, to bring her their hard problems instead of their solved ones, which was the sign she valued most that something was working. She had Patricia Kwan, who had become something between a lawyer and a trusted advisor in a way that Claire had not planned and was grateful for. She had her father, who still communicated primarily through understatement and had recently, without being asked, begun copying her on correspondence she needed to see, which was his way of saying he trusted her judgment. She had Margaret's lamb on Sundays when she got there, which was not every Sunday but was more Sundays than before. And she had Adrian, which was still new enough that she was careful with it, careful in the way of someone who understood her own history with making herself too small inside something she'd chosen. She was watching herself in it, monitoring for the old pattern, the self-erasure, the quiet accumulation of concessions that added up to disappearance. She hadn't seen it yet. She was going to keep watching. He was already at the conference hotel when she arrived, and they had dinner that evening at a restaurant overlooking the lake, and the conversation was the same as it always was, substantial and not effortless, both of them with strong opinions and the occasional visible friction that came from 2 people who had developed their thinking independently and didn't automatically align. She told him something about the Bronx Project's final approval process that she hadn't told anyone else yet, a last-minute complication from a council member who'd tried to extract a concession that Claire had refused and that had cost them 3 weeks and made her genuinely furious. "What did you do?" he said. "I went back to Diane Reyes," she said, "and I told her exactly what had happened, and Diane made a phone call." She paused. "I didn't enjoy needing the phone call." "No. But I made it anyway." She looked at the lake. I used to think asking for help meant I hadn't done it right, that if the work was good enough, it should move on its own. She picked up her wine glass. The work never moves on its own. It always needs someone making calls. That's not a comfortable thing to learn. No, she said, but it's better than the alternative. He looked at her. Which is? Doing everything alone and calling it strength. He was quiet for a moment. I've done that, he said. I know, she said. I've watched you do it. He looked slightly caught, which she appreciated. I'm working on it, he said. I know that too. The lake was going silver in the evening light. Claire thought about the Harrington Tower lobby, about a navy dress and a ruined shoe, about standing in an alcove looking at her own face in a compact mirror and finding something there that held. She thought about 43 pages of financial records and a boardroom and an acknowledgement signed on a Wednesday and a conference room in March with a site rendering on the table between two people who had once been married and were now, imperfectly and with considerable difficulty, becoming something else. Colleagues, maybe. In time, something closer to people who had known each other long enough that the hard parts had become just part of the history. She thought about Sienna Blake in Ohio and hoped again that she was okay, and found that the hope came more easily now than it had in December. She thought about her father on the phone saying 5 to 2, and then now we build something real. And about what it felt like to build something real, the specific weight of it, the fact that it was never clean and was always worth it. She thought about the woman who had stood in a lobby in November and been laughed at, and had gone to an alcove and come back. Had come back not as a correction, not as a reversal, not as revenge. Those had never been the right frame for it, though she'd tried the frame on and understood its appeal. She'd come back because hiding had cost her more than showing up ever would, and because somewhere in the accumulated years of making herself smaller, she'd lost the ability to see herself clearly, and she had needed the champagne and the looking away and the cold marble floor of the Harrington Tower, which her father had built, which she had walked into alone on a November evening in a simple navy dress, to finally fully understand that. The greatest humiliation was not the champagne. It was the years before it, the slow self-subtraction. That was the thing she wouldn't do again. Not because she'd perfected herself, not because she'd resolved every old habit or made peace with every difficult memory, but because she had learned, at cost, in the specific way that real learning works, which is never cheap and never entirely comfortable, what it felt like to be visible, to be fully present in her own life, to let the record be accurate. That knowledge was hers. Nobody was going to pour champagne on it. Adrian picked up his wine glass. To the conference, he said. To the conference, she said. They touched glasses. Outside, the lake moved in the way lakes do, indifferent, continuous, older than the city built around it, and the evening light went slowly gold and then gone, and Claire Ashford sat at a table with a person who saw her clearly and ate good food and was not done, not finished, not a completed version of herself, but present and purposeful, and at last entirely her own.